Welcome back to Selling Circular, the podcast where we're rethinking the status quo of capitalism by exploring innovations in the circular economy. Today, we're ripping into the world of textile recycling and the challenges facing the fashion industry as it strives for sustainability. I'm Sabira Lakhani, VP of Product at Reaply.
And I'm Garr Punnett, CEO of Loop Layer. I really enjoy how you introduce these shows because I think I come in a little hot. And I don't know if that's mic popping. I don't know if I'm just excited to say the first words of welcome back to Selling Circular, but I need to work on that because you just eased us right in with an NPR level of ambiance of audio.
Oh my
But if
God,
this is your
what a
first time, we're thrilled to
compliment.
have you back here as a part of this growing community dedicated to advancing the circular economy. The best way to help us and our growth of the movement is to share these clips, subscribe, or tell your friends about our podcast. Even those colleagues that might be in your field who you guys share an interest in this and maybe just take that shot. Go connect over a potential podcast. We would love to be that connection. Today's episode, no different of being really good. We've got the textile industry as one of the largest polluters globally with millions of tons of clothing ending up in landfills each year. Last season, Marissa Adler, who co-authored the report of Sorting for Circularity USA, shared with us that determining the material makeup of the clothing is actually one of the hardest and most important challenges in determining its end of life and its potential recyclability. So our guest today is at the forefront of this solution, and that's Constanza Gomez, the co-founder of Sortile, a company that's developed groundbreaking technology to identify and assist in sorting textile materials for recycling. And it's Constanza's journey from pitching her idea at the Circularity Conference where we attended to building that company now is pretty inspiring about how they've just got major brands and recyclers now that are joining them to really figure out how do they solve this end of market problem for these textiles.
And as consumers become more aware of this issue, there is a growing demand for brands to develop or use solutions that can help close the loop in fashion. And in a great business model twist, not only does Sortile's innovative hardware and software combination help solve this complex problem of textile identification, but now it's also shedding light on the broader procurement challenges in the fashion supply chain. And yeah, we were there when she pitched this
Yeah, I remember it.
topic, and it really stuck with me. And we talk about that in the episode too. But the device itself, it looks
Simple.
like a small little brick that's
Yeah.
like, I don't like, can this even do anything visually? But apparently the technology is advanced enough now that you can actually get into the nitty gritty of what something is made of.
I
How
think
cool is
that's
that?
what, yeah, and I think that's what is just continuing to amaze and even surprise. Well, just I don't even know, shock. I'll go shock of the volumes. And so even in processing these volumes, to your point on a device, you still need to be able to quickly identify. And so volume and your ability to solve these problems are going to be based on speed and ability to recognize quickly, and that's just something we can't avoid, but it's ultimately something that we're all trying to solve in the circular economy industry is, well, when things are aggregated back, what do you do now? And really, where do
Yeah.
you go from there?
Yeah. And coming from the world of waste sorting, I can like see in my mind the kind of like operational lift that it would take to manually sort without a technology like this. Like you're wading into very like literally murky end product, right? And this technology enables somebody who has no knowledge of what they're looking at. You need no expertise. It totally flips sorting on its head. So very much a true innovation play in the circular economy. I would even say business model came second and hardware came first, which was really cool.
I think from those mislabeling of materials, that's what was most appealing to me. Is now not only, and I almost, it's kind of, and I don't want to put too much like a halo around this, but it's really interesting where what we get to is how in a circular business model innovation, you're actually now also solving for one of the status quo problems. So that is very interesting, and I think everyone will enjoy hearing that.
Yep. Constanza brought her insights about what the industry is struggling with, and that ranges not only from mislabeled materials but also the complexity of global textile trade. So join us in this journey when we explore Sortile's technology and how the company is using it to make recycling more efficient. And we also get into the impact of new regulations, and it all caps off with what's the future of circular fashion.
I think it's that EPR business model economic push that's going to be really interesting, and that's going to take the Sortile types of solutions to the next level where they have to figure it out. It's a state or federal mandate either in the US or in Europe, and it's going to have to be brought together with some type of solution. We both loved it. We were geeking out the whole time, and so enjoy the episode.
Well, welcome, Constanza, to Selling Circular. We're really excited to have you. I think I saw you on stage actually a couple of years ago at Circularity, and I was like, that girl knows what's up. I was very inspired. I was very happy that you won, right? You won that year.
I did. That was the first time I pitched live ever.
Wow. Well, you were great.
That was great. I do remember that. Now that you mentioned that. Yeah.
What was the award? Is like the New Innovations Award?
It was Accelerate. That's what it's called. Accelerate at Circularity.
Yes.
Yeah.
So like new ideas.
We came in second the first year they did it.
The first year, not the second.
Yeah, the first year we did it. Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm trying to remember who won that year. But great little opportunity to pitch and get up and get eyeballs.
Well, yeah,
and also like, but yes.
You were great. I remember I was like, okay, she knows. And I remember feeling, because I had actually come out of working in India with municipal waste, and we were starting to think about how we could work with textile waste. And I remember thinking like, there's a real problem, but this hardware is going to be like dramatically impactful for the industry. So it's been a couple of years since then. So maybe just tell us like, what is Sortile? What do you do? And kind of what has your journey been for the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's been, almost 2.5 years now. A real kickoff was really at Circularity. We hadn't really incorporated the company fully yet at that moment or anything. So that was like I said, the first time I pitched live to an audience. But really what we do is we do identification, sorting, and then we facilitate the connection to recyclers, textile recyclers in the industry. And the way we do that is we have a hardware. Actually have one here that looks like this, that is able to identify the textile composition or the material composition of clothing in under a second. And the reason that that's important is because recycling is material specific, as I'm sure most of the people here know. But with textiles, most people have no idea what our clothing's made out of. And with blend, it's getting increasingly harder for people to know what our clothing's made out of. And so this machine makes it really, really easy for that sorting to happen. Additionally, we collect a ton of data on everything that's sorted. We get data from our own machine. We connect actually to a lot of the systems that our clients have. So sales systems, other machinery that they might have, and so on and so forth. And so we collect a lot of data from sorters and collectors in the industry. And we use that data really to try and help them to sell to the best available markets that they have.
That's very cool. I have so many questions already. Let's start with the hardware, the piece that you just showed us. I'm imagining like the process is kind of like one piece at a time, and then like data is piped to some sort of database. That is it like it's 60% polyester and 20% cotton, or is it just like it's mostly polyester? Yeah, how does it work?
So we basically have 3 tiers of models. And one of the things that we try to do really hard is to make this really, really simple. So to your point, it is piece by piece. But what I think most people don't realize is that clothing sortation is already piece by piece, because they're trying to figure out what quality of reuse they can actually sell it to. Most sorting houses sort for reuse, not for recycling. And so the way we integrate with them is when they're making that call, okay, does this fit into one of, the hundreds of 100 or 200, different reuse categories? A lot of the times the item will not fit into any of those categories. It'll be stained, it'll be, ripped, the quality is just not going to be there. There's tons of different potential scenarios, and then more clothing that you might think actually does not fit into a reuse category. And so at that point, the person's already touching the garment, and so we don't add an extra touch to the system, and they'll just place it on our device and get an identification like, hey, this is cotton, it can go to a cotton market, or poly can go to a poly market, and so on and so forth. We color code everything because the person that's sorting doesn't really care about materials, and so we'll tell them like, hey, this goes into bin green or red or whatever. But we do collect all of that underlying data and send it to management. And so in terms of the models, we have like really simple like go, no go models. So we'll have clients that'll be like, hey, my recycler is interested in anything that's like 90% cotton, but I don't really care what that remaining 10% is. It's contaminant, it can be whatever. And so that's like our go, no go. Like, hey, does it have at least 90%? Yes or no? And we don't care about the remaining 10. We won't tell you, like it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. And then we have full-on regressions, not for every blend, but we do have them for the most prevalent blends. And so in those cases, for example, you're interested in knowing exactly the percentage of poly cotton in a single garment. And in those cases, our machine's able to do that. Hey, this is a 60-40 poly cotton blend. Or, poly spandex. This is a 93.7% poly spandex blend. And then we have like our monomaterial models. And those are models that are, hey, we're trying to identify something that's 100% cotton, 100% poly, and so on and so forth. And we have those models as well. And so all of our clients have like a custom setup. So we have all of these models that run, and they always run in the background. Our clients just aren't aware of it. And we just make visible the part that's important for them. And so we'll talk to them and say like, hey, what are your goals? Who are you trying to think of in terms of recycling markets? Who are you actively selling to today? And we tailor the machine to sort for what they're looking for so that we don't bombard them with information because it's not useful for their process. But for example, if we notice, and it's happened a handful of times, like, hey, you're sorting a lot of wool, for example. Wool's weird. It's a really valuable material, but it's usually a low percentage of the volume that companies process. And so like we've had a couple of companies say, hey, you're processing a lot of wool. Would you be interested in selling to a wool recycler? And like sometimes it's a yes, sometimes it's a no, but we work with them to try and make those connections.
Okay, so I already love that almost that predictive sale where
Yeah.
you're adding value to almost in a category that was unknown to them of what they
Right.
might be doing in their actions already. How have you found that your selling Sortile to a company has either been easy, where it fits the value that's needed immediately, but also there's guaranteed to be challenges in there in putting a hardware component into the operational mix? Where have you found that ease and that challenge and how that fits into the selling, sort of your selling motion?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of learnings that we've gone through in this process.
It's
I
the fun
wouldn't
part.
say that selling, absolutely. I wouldn't say that selling's been easy per
Yeah.
se.
No.
Uh, a lot of these companies, like I said, they've been sorting for reuse. They're companies that have been established for decades. These are not necessarily, obviously, there's new players in the space because of the excitement for circularity in recent years. But a lot of these players have been around for a really, really long time. A lot of them are tech averse, and a lot of them are kind of a little bit skeptical about this change into recycling. And so I want to say when we first started, obviously there's first movers and people that get excited at the beginning, and also, but when we first started about 2.5 years ago, it was kind of hard. We would talk about this, and this is an industry where there's not a lot of data. And so some of the conversations we would have is like, what are you talking about recycling textiles? Like this is silly. Like, why would you want to do this? I was like, well, it could be a potential new recycling market, a new market for you, additional revenue. A lot of these people, like, what are there's regulation that's upcoming. Oh, regulation, it's never going to pass. We've now realized that it has passed. And so that in itself has changed a little bit of that rhetoric. I want to say even within the last year. I remember talking, there's this big conference that I go to where a lot of the players in the space go. And we were talking like about our tech and about, EPR laws that were coming. California hadn't passed at that time because it's pretty recent. European Union was still in discussions. And so it was a little bit up in the air. But the writing was a little bit on the wall. I mean, Europe was like, a handful of countries had already passed it. European Union was pretty advanced in conversations. And even though California hadn't passed, like everybody was pretty confident it was going to. And they were like, no, this is never going to pass. It's not going to be real. We're just going to continue doing business as we're doing business. And I'm going to that same conference later this month, November. And I'm getting emails prior to the conference saying like, hey, we noticed you're going to the conference, would love to reconnect and, learn about this. And it's been a year. It hasn't been that long, but so much has changed in terms of regulation and in terms of appetite. And so I'm not saying that like the industry is going to adopt this like immediately today, but there's definitely more interest given these new like regulatory framework. I think another one of our big learnings is when we went in, we were trying to sell hardware. They were like, no, like not interested. And it wasn't until we figured out that we could sell the hardware, but not only the hardware, but help them understand the recycling markets that we really were able to sell. Because these clients, like I said, they were selling for reuse, not recycling. So we were talking to them about recycling and they had no idea what we were talking about. Again, I'm generalizing. Obviously, there's some that did, but it was that piece that we could give them, like the additional knowledge, the additional know-how of like, how can we sell to these markets beyond just like the sorting piece that really allowed us to start selling.
I love it. There's no better feeling than before you're going to a conference, knowing that you have things lined up already. Like
Yeah.
that, it takes away that general conference anxiety that we've always talked about. It's like, all right, we're gonna try to make some magic happen, but when things are coming in, that's great. My
Absolutely.
only follow up, Sabira, on that real quickly is, I when I'm thinking of that almost that you're seemingly coming out of the educational curve, and you're coming more into the people are seeing policy happen live.
Yeah.
Your sales motion is getting more ironed out, where you're realizing the hardware is just what comes with the almost the value add of the software, right, and the analysis and education you're able to deliver back to a client. And I think that's one of those understandings that comes from just the maturing of the company and the sales motion, and clients saying, hey, we're not interested in this aspect. Well, that is the most important aspect, but okay, we're going to sell you this instead. And this is just going to all be one package. So it's
Right.
part of that evolution that I always love hearing about.
I was curious to talk also about the evolution of the recycling market, because the more that you can aggregate, like in your wool example, if the company was originally throwing that wool out or it was getting mixed in with other materials, then that has an impact on the downstream end market because that there's lost supply there. So how have you seen, maybe like which materials have you seen that actually happen with, where
Yeah.
there's motivation for a new player or new infrastructure to be developed?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot to be done in the recycling market. So there's still a lot of growth that needs to happen. I will say, in broad terms, what is recycled today or what can be recycled today at some level of scale, because the market is still small, is wool, cotton, and polyester. And that's really it. Obviously, there's, chemical recyclers that are coming online that can handle, more materials, but their facilities today are still pilot facilities, right? At most they'll have like 10,000 maybe ton facility, something like that. But in the grand scheme of things, it's really small. There's very few of the new like advanced chemical recyclers that are at scale. And one of the things that's been interesting is when I first started, and this is, the mistakes you make, potentially as founders, when we got started, we were really excited about the advanced chemical recyclers. And we were like, this is the way forward. We're going to engage them. These are the people we're going to sell to in terms of like the materials that our companies are sorting for. Still super excited for them, but I didn't realize at that time how important consistency is for process building. And the issue with them having these really small facilities is that you don't have to sort a lot to provide to them. And so anybody that wants to kind of stand up, even if it's manual sorting a little bit, can start engaging them, but they have a very limited capacity. So they'll maybe put an order for 1 month, but then not order anything for 6 months. At that time, their specs might change. So it's really difficult to stand up like a streamlined process. I do think there's
And
still the future. They can handle a ton more materials and everything.
well, and this is
But
because
to
the technology's still developing. Like, is that the
the
street,
technology is
the
still
value?
developing,
Okay,
and they haven't, like, there's a whole process for like the material science companies, right? First you start in the
right.
lab, then you grow a little bit bigger, then you have your pilot facility, and then you get to a commercial industrial size, right? And there's different challenges at all of those steps, different kinks that need to be ironed out at all of those steps, right? And so a lot of the, companies that we're really excited about in advanced chemical recycling today are kind of have validated their pilot facilities and are starting to move to commercial facilities, but they need to be built, they need to get the financing. It doesn't happen immediately, right? And so that's been one of the things that we kind of learned at the beginning. It's like we were really, really excited about the company. Again, still super excited about them, but we had to kind of take a step back. And I was like, well, that's not what recycling can do. Like, that's not the recycling we can do at some sort of scale today. And if we want to start talking with our clients of sorting for recycling, they can't just sort and do nothing with it. And so we had to move to mechanical recycling. So thermomechanical for poly and mechanical recycling for cotton. And I think one of the things that I've been super excited to see is we've seen a lot of growth, both in capacity as well as improvements in the technology in mechanical recycling. And like an example, there's a recycler we work with in Central America. And when we started working with them, they had only one dedicated line to mechanical cotton recycling. And they're tripling their capacity. They're opening 3 new lines by the end of this year. And so in like when we first started working with them like a year and a half ago. So in a year and a half, they've tripled their capacity of mechanical cotton recycling. And part of that is demand from brands. And that in itself helps to kind of work through the kinks, the logistic kinks that are going to be part of this process and need to happen.
No, I was gonna go backwards as we play chicken here on who's gonna ask a good question. Well, I think that's so interesting to hear that evolution, and that made me wonder about your own technology evolution. Because like there's all these downstream, just to explain my logic, there's all these downstream market impacts. You're not dependent, but there's like an interplay
Absolutely.
between what's happening downstream, economically, technologically, from an infrastructure perspective, but from your own, what you can control or what you could control. Tell us a little bit about the journey from the idea to like the hardware to the software. How far have you come? How far do you want to
Yeah.
go? Where are you in your own
I
journey?
love these questions because it lets me reflect, because I'm always bogged down on like we need to improve this and this and this, and it's not often that I get to reflect on what we've actually built. I'll start by saying I'm not a hardware person. I'm a software person. I do machine learning algorithms, but hardware is not my strong suit. And so when we started, oh my God, we made so many mistakes. When we started, it was me, my co-founder's not technical. And so it was us looking at YouTube videos on like how to connect cables. And so like imagine what our like first iteration of this was. It was like us really kind of like playing with cables. And as we progress, I've obviously hired someone that knows hardware today. And for like the first year, we 3D printed all of our devices. Today, we actually no longer 3D print. We have our own PCB boards instead of everything connected with the cables. It's just progressed significantly. both from the hardware itself, but also like the software, the algorithms have gotten so much better. We identify way more things, better accuracy. One of the big challenges we had to solve, which was interesting, and a super interesting challenge for me, is most of the coding I had done hadn't dealt with like sensors and hardware. And when we first built our machine learning models, we had like a few machines, like we hadn't really sold much, and like components are expensive, so we had like, you know, a few, like less, around 5. And so we built the code, everything was working great, and so we put in an order to build like 20 because we had clients interested. And the first thing we realized is that those 20 sensors were really different from the ones we had originally bought. And so our models, it wasn't like it went from like, you know, 95 to like 50% accuracy, but it was significantly less accurate. And we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And since then, obviously, we figured there's calibration techniques you can apply and everything to be able to use the same models, even though the sensors have variabilities within them. But it's been an entire learning curve, both from the software side and the hardware side. Honestly, it's been just wild.
Well, I think this. I tend to bring this up often in these conversations where not only from a circular economy perspective are you dealing with multifaceted, layered problems, but the complication of what many of us are trying to do often involves that material science, which needs to introduce physical ways to identify materials. And this is one of those examples where it is difficult to now not just go and say, hey, we're only software, but now you have to have a hardware component, of which historically we can go through some of the greatest innovations that have been hardware, and they come with these great painful stories of saying, we had this version that moved to this version and we didn't realize X, and we had to immediately think through that. But it seems so indicative of just almost circular economy in general, of trying to always play the different value chain components, try to figure out what's going to benefit, any type of stakeholder. And this is just another one of those things that you're able to take on in this hardware component.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that, and I'm going to say this because I say this to everyone, and I'm just hoping it gets out there more. One of the biggest challenges that we have when building our models is the lack of knowledge, not just by consumers, because consumers, there's no reason for us to have this knowledge, but from brands, from manufacturers, of what's actually in our clothing. And so I'll give you an example. We were doing some studies on our cotton model, and we started realizing that there was a subset that was slightly off. Like it wasn't like the exact cotton curve, but it looked like cotton. And we were like, what is this? It's so weird. So we started digging, and this was like data that we saw from our clients. So we started doing some research, and we realized that men's shirts, we were seeing an increase in men's shirts that were caught, like that had a variation on the curve. And like, okay, that's weird. I mean, men's dress shirts, they're like cotton. Like, why are we seeing this variation? And we realized that it's because of the wrinkle-free, iron-free, and that's what's causing this like slight variation in what we're seeing. And so we were like, okay, it'd be great to be able to do some research on, what these additives are, like how prevalent they are, how many variations of them are there, because not every company uses the same one. And so we started asking around, like, hey, do you have like any samples, anything that you can give us that has, a particular additive that's like wrinkle-free or iron-free? Nobody knows. And it's wild. It's wild. What? And so, I'm sure there's somebody that knows, but like, it's not widespread knowledge.
Not easy to find. Right? Not.
Well, this is the thing that people sometimes don't understand about when you start digging back some of these innovations or new materials where it's like, it's just been created without necessarily everyone knowing what it is, why it's there.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Another example, we have been grappling. So nylon in particular as a material, nylon 6 and 6.6 have completely different recycling streams. They cannot be recycled in the same manner. And a lot of technical clothing has nylon. And so they're like, okay, it'd be great. We can identify nylon, but like we can't today do the nylon 6 and 6.6. We need more data. So I went out, reached out to a bunch of brands. Hey, can you tell us what nylon you're using in your products? And we asked tens of brands, and we got responses from 3 that actually knew the type of nylon they used in the products. And it's wild. Like I'm not even
That
talking
is
about
wild.
additives here. I'm talking about like
Like the main
materials.
thing. Yeah. I'm
And
wondering,
so that makes it really difficult.
well, I'm curious, have any, as you're talking, like I'm just thinking this is a perfect technology innovation that could bring circularity like actually full circle, right? Like if a brand at the beginning knows what they're putting into material and they have kind of like a system to do take back and sorting of their own product, then they would have like enough volume to do chemical recycling. Like this,
Right.
having this piece of information when you do the reverse logistics, you know, you wouldn't be able to just know looking at it. Having technology like yours matters a lot. Have you seen any brands kind of like actually, in addition to like info sharing, actually bite into like we can play a role in the movement and in closing the loop?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, so in this case with the nylon, we had 3 brands kind of engage with us. And we, like, obviously it was a long process. We had to sign all these NDAs and, there's proprietary materials things and whatever. But we ended up working with them and they like ended up supplying data for us. It was really great. We still work with them. We've engaged with brands in like a handful of different ways. Another example is a brand that we had originally just talked like peripherally with at one point reached out and was like, "Hey, I have this new supplier. Uh, I just ordered like my new order of t-shirts came in. They're supposed to be 100% cotton, but I don't know. I don't really trust it. Can you come here?" And I was like, "Okay." I couldn't go. My co-founder went, so she did testing, and yeah, a lot of the product that they sent, not all, but a lot of the product they had sent actually included poly in it. And we're like, "What are you going to do with this?" And they were like, "Oh, well, I'll turn around and like talk to the supplier and get a, significant discount on the order because it was like not met correctly." I was like, I had never even thought that this happened, right? That brands
Yeah.
would order and that they wouldn't really get the materials that they
That somehow
ordered.
there's like an accountability aspect that's needed in this.
Right. And so again, got me thinking of there's just such a lack of control, maybe is the word, of the supply chain. And I think to some extent that's known, right? The supply chain is so complex that it's really, really difficult to kind of see how everything flows, and brands have not a lot of visibility of that. But
Hmm.
that causes all of these issues, whether it's the fact that you're getting the wrong materials on your products. That product is probably going to be mislabeled, whether it's, it was
Hmm.
labeled as 100% cotton, but it wasn't. And so then if somebody's doing manual sorting and looking at tags, they're gonna, put it in the wrong category for recycling. And so it causes all these downstream issues, right?
Oh, you're on mute, Gar.
Terrible, terrible. There's a part of me that just wants to go and now just have a device in my hand and just walk
Mm.
around testing
Check.
everything I want to wear, because I
Yeah.
think there's the accountability in the supply chain aspect. Is it also makes sense that if you're procuring materials from a supplier, how often are the brands actually checking in on at least a somewhat consistent basis? I'm sure they do their audits,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that's when they'll see, and they have some sort of probably degree of variance of which they're able to accept. But how often are they doing that? Are they doing that once a year, twice a year? I'm actually now very curious. We'll have to talk to a brand and see
Yeah.
what how they're doing it. But I mean, that goes to again the accountability aspect in procurement and supply chains and what's actually being delivered to us as consumers. That when I'm buying something that I hope is 100% cotton, I hope it is, because I'm trying to avoid some sort of poly
Right.
fabric potentially
Well, have you thought about like a family product, like a household
of
product?
the household product.
So, I mean, I would say less of a household product.
Right.
So our device today is cheap for a business, but is not cheap enough that I would say a regular consumer can purchase, right? Um, but one of the things we're working really hard is we weren't thinking about consumers at that point, but informal waste pickers. So I'm originally from Chile. And a lot of textiles move through informal markets. So uh, people that purchase from these importers and sell in these informal markets, and then what eventually ends up in the desert. And one of the things we've thought about is if you maybe get these people the right technology at the right price point, you could potentially incentivize them to sort for recycling if it's easy enough, instead of them being like, oh, I'm just going to throw it out into the desert, right? Like if you can create a potential incentives for them to do the right thing, um, you obviously have to arm them with technology. But for that, the price point of our device needs to be significantly lower than it is today. So it's definitely something that we're working on. I hadn't thought of it as a consumer product per se. But
Yeah.
yes, definitely thinking about the price point for sure.
Well, because another kind of, it's not just, I think just not just the knowledge. I think like like for example, after watching Dark Waters and Aaron Brockovich, right? Like there's a lot of mistrust of
Yeah.
large companies, and I think for good reason. We've had some guests on our podcast talk about how the fossil fuel industry is like literally all over our bodies, right? And I think
Yeah.
there's a real concern that forever chemicals are on our bodies and near our food, and just the switch to linens or 100% cotton can be really meaningful for individual and public health, really, right? So I see like the health impact being kind of humongous with your technology, and yeah, I hope
Yeah.
that that happens one day.
I hadn't thought about that angle of technology per se. Obviously, I've thought about it to your point of my own personal life. And so I've definitely switched to organics and moving away from synthetic materials and all of that. My mom laughs at me because she's like, you're so picky with your clothing now. And it's like, it's just, I know. And like, once you know, you can't unknow, right? Um, and so, yeah, I hadn't thought of that angle per se, but it's a good point, for sure.
The Not to transition directly more into then brand relationships and working with particular industries. I'm really curious what has that conversation been like with association groups,
Yeah,
maybe of a type of commodity? I look at some of the goals of the cotton industry, and this seems like something that, as they're supporting probably their recycling, either mechanic, but it's probably mechanical of that side of their industry. This seems like something that would be directly applicable to them. Have you approached those types of associations? Have you been in those types of conversations? How do you even start that type of conversation as you approach these larger associations that might have an interest in this?
yeah. So we approached a couple of those associations. We've done a couple of demos with them, and that obviously has resulted in some relationships popping up.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it, like to your point, there's still a lot of education that needs to happen. And so a lot of these associations are super old school and like they're going through, learning just like we all are, to be real. This is a nascent industry, so like I'm learning every day too. And so yes, we do engage with them. We try to do a lot of educational stuff, whether it's with our device or not. I like to speak a lot, and I do speak a lot about the reality in Latin America because that's where I'm from and where I have most knowledge about. So try to educate about what's happening there. Why are clothing's exported to Latin America? We might disagree with it, but there's a reason why it happens and why it's going to certain markets. And so kind of just educating of why these things are happening, what kind of regulation could be interesting, to kind of address some of those things and all of that.
I want to drill down then. What do you think the discrepancy is, and what's your take on exports of clothing, of textiles to Latin America? And then
Yeah,
what's maybe another side that you maybe are in opposition to?
sure. So there's a side of the exports to Latin America that is positive, and I always start with that. It's not just pure evil like some people try to like dress it as. Um, my biggest experience is with Chile. Chile's one of the largest importers of secondhand clothes from the US. It's the second largest from Latin America. The largest is Guatemala. And Chile, for example, does not have a textile industry. There's no textile industry in Chile. And so literally, okay, maybe not all, obviously there might be like one designer that does their stuff. But let's say like 95% of clothing that is worn in Chile is imported into the country, whether it's new clothing or secondhand clothing. And so the secondhand clothing trade is actually super important, particularly for more vulnerable communities. Just from a dignity standpoint, but also from a business standpoint. A lot of families actually make their living off of secondhand clothing. And that's a reality. What is less okay is sending waste, things that cannot be reused, to a country that today does not have the infrastructure to manage it. Now, I know why it happens. It happens because sorting is cheaper in Chile than it is in the US. It's just a labor equation. Labor is cheaper. And so the selling of credential or unsorted goods, it just happens from an economical standpoint. But it still means that you're sending stuff, since it's unsorted in the US, you're sending stuff, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So I'm not going to say that everybody does it, from an ill will perspective, knowingly or unknowingly, to a country that can't really, from an infrastructure standpoint, manage it. And so there's different ways of tackling that, whether it's, putting regulation in to whether it's EPRs that incentivize sortation, or putting more regulation on the importing country of the types and the quality of things that can be imported. So there's different ways that you can address that, or even arming the importing country with technology. So one of our big projects right now is in the north of Chile, which is where most of these clothing gets imported, working with the importers so that the stuff that is bad, it doesn't really get to the informal sellers, right? So it's addressed at the port, basically, and they can then send it to recycling markets, and then you're not, polluting the country in itself. So there's different ways that you can address it. But I think my biggest, flag there is it just needs to be addressed and it needs to be recognized, right? And so secondhand trade by itself, not bad. A lot of communities get a lot of good with it, but just recognize that the second-hand trade today also trades in waste as a subset of how they're trading.
I really appreciate your creative approach of like handling the problem at the port. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And like that, the international connection of the circular economy is also really poignant because supply chains start on one side of the world, when we think about the linear economy, it kind of just feels like, oh, it's just a straight line, but it's actually like around the globe, right? Like it's getting grown somewhere, manufactured somewhere, sold somewhere else across the world, and then dumped somewhere else across the world. It's kind of like this crazy network of chaos is our linear economy. But you hinted at California's new EPR regulation and just wanted to pick your brain on, what's your reaction to it? Does it go far enough? What were you hoping from it? And what can we also take from it that is like a good model for others?
I mean, to your question of does it go far enough? I think the answer is that we don't know, right? I mean, it's the first EPR law in the US. Like, we don't know. I think it's a huge step in the right direction. I think all of these regulations are going to go through iterations. Bottle bills did for years. California has a carpets EPR, and they've been adjusting the level of their eco fees, right? There's a lot of learnings that come from implementation. And so I think just passing the law has been a huge step in the right direction. And there's always going to be like, hey, there's issues with this. There's always going to be issues that you can fix, but we need to get started. I think my biggest fear when discussions as SB 707 were going around is like, if that doesn't pass this year, we're going to be delayed another year. And everybody knew that once it passed, it's not that it passed and it's like, okay, EPR exists today, right? There's a 5-year phasing period. And there's reasons why it's 5 years, right? The first year is the needs assessment, which I think is absolutely necessary because without the needs assessment, how do you know what eco fees you need to put in? And so I'm the first one to say like, hey, I want EPR to be here today. Yes. But I also understand that policy doesn't work that way. And there's steps that need to be taken. So I think that's my biggest take. I think it's a huge step in the right direction. I think there's definitely going to be kinks that will need to be ironed out, but that's true of almost every new regulation that gets implemented. And so I'm just super glad that we're getting started and that it's going to be a model for other states to kind of emulate.
Projecting out, where do you think or believe or hope or positioning yourself for Sortile to affect future policy and future decision making at that type of scale and really educating these types of efforts?
Yeah, so we are part of ACT, so American Circular Textiles. It's a policy group, and that's most of how we do our advocacy. We've participate actively in their sessions. We've given feedback. When SB 707 ACT was part of the groups that gave feedback, so we participated through that. We've done lobby days for the Americas Act in DC. For those of you, the Americas Act is a trade bill that's currently introduced that has about 14 billion in incentives for circular fashion. And so that's mostly how we do our advocacy in terms of policy. I've learned a lot about policy, but I'm not a policy expert. I'm a tech person. Obviously, I've learned about industry and I have perspective, but policy is super nuanced and I'm not that person. So I'm glad that I'm part of a group that has people that have that expertise and I can give my industry perspective and give my feedback of what I think is, appropriate or not appropriate or, goes far enough or not far enough in different regulation. But somebody has like that policy background that can kind of help funnel that.
I'm curious, we're starting to near the end of our time together, but before we get to our last and final question, which I will let Garr ask, I'm just curious, where do you see like Sortile over the next few years? Like what areas of growth have you been thinking about, or where do you want to push the boundaries from a technology perspective? Like what's up next?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the hardware. We're working really hard on trying to make it significantly cheaper. Like I said, we want to be able to make it more accessible to more groups of people beyond just like established businesses. From a data and relationships perspective, I think that's one of the things that's got me really, really excited. And I think the logistics is a piece that still needs a lot of work because you haven't been able to do this at scale yet. And so there's a lot that needs to happen from a logistics standpoint. So how do you aggregate? And we have a lot of that data of like where people are sorting, what materials they're seeing. So like how can the data we're seeing kind of inform how and where you potentially aggregate some of these textiles? Because recycling is at scale, like it works at scale, but collection is hyper local, right? You collect in towns and schools and communities. And so we have a ton of that data of like that could potentially help inform some of those logistics decisions. And that's one of the things that gets me really, really excited.
That's I love that aspect because then you're educating more of the economics too. What do you still find and maybe this is just another barrier of, as we're pushing this solution, that we've got these unpaid for externality costs that are still sort of almost taken advantage of in our linear system.
Yeah.
How are you seeing that? The aggregation sortation element at hyperlocally is very important to educate downstream effects of where who pays for almost all of this at the back end. How do you account for this? How are you talking about this, and what else needs to change in this economic model to make this more of a reality?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things there.
Yeah. Good luck in answering it in a minute. Yeah.
Oh God. Okay, so EPR laws by themselves
Yeah.
give, rearrange incentives a little bit, right? So those in itself are super helpful. Something that I am actually trying to do a deep dive right now and learn more about is incentives that the fossil fuel industry gets today for the production of, poly, plastics, and all of that, right? And trying to understand how those have influenced how our clothing is or our textiles are made today and kind of what happens if those potentially go away. and I'm not, again, this is something that I'm learning about today, like started reading about this last week. So definitely not an expert, but definitely an area that I'm trying to learn more about. How do those incentives work? Because those are the incentives that work kind of against us, if you will, right? That keep the pricing of virgin synthetics at a price that is not necessarily price competitive with recycled materials today. Obviously, as they scale, that they potentially may get there, but it's the subsidies that we're working on the other side, right?
It's a great call out. I mean, this is, and I want you to get to that final point, but this is almost the relationship, my relationship tech wise with Elon Musk and his late foray we don't have to get into. But that's unfortunate. However, I always loved the point he was making as is introducing more EVs into the market, that he was saying, don't give EVs the subsidies, just take away potentially the subsidies that's already been giving to the internal combustion engine industry, that then it just equals the playing field a little bit more and makes it actually more of a, and I hate even saying it, a free market play, and saying, hey, there's more that can be done to support this by just taking away some of the subsidies for what we don't need more of.
Right. And my last point was kind of in line with that. If you look at other industries that have gone greener, right, whether it's EVs or, renewable energy, right? These are industries that got subsidies and incentives for decades before they became price competitive, right? And it's those incentives and those subsidies that allowed us to transition. We can argue if we've truly transitioned, but at least in the process of transition from what used to be normal to something that is more environmentally friendly, right? And the textile industry is a huge industry, but like people aren't thinking about that yet. The Americas Act, I think, is the first time those types of incentives have ever been discussed in the States to do something of a green transition in the industry, right? And so I think those types of policy beyond just EPR, because like I said, the recyclers need to build industrial facilities, and that involves millions and millions and millions of dollars in investments, right? And we've got to find some way to finance that.
Sabira, why don't you take us out?
Yeah, Garr cheated by asking an additional question, but it was a great question, so it's cool. Well, we've heard great things about your company. You clearly kind of understand the market dynamics. You have a strong idea for the future, but what gives you the most hope for where the textile industry is headed?
Tough question. I think the tone of the conversations that I've had in the last months is what gives me the most hope. So, and obviously it's tied to regulation and the fact that regulation is real. But when we started this, like I said, it was, a couple of people that, wanted to do good. But now we're having people that like basically laughed us out of a room at one point come to us and be like, hey, we heard this EPR law passed in California. What's that going to mean for me? How do I need to change? And so the fact that people are starting to question how that change needs to happen gives me a lot of hope, because I don't think anybody knows what the end of this is going to be, and it's going to take a lot of smart people to get us there. And so the more people that are starting to question these issues, it's more people putting their brains to trying to solve it. And so I think that's one of the things that gives me a lot of hope.
I love that. You're basically saying, just to sum this up in almost the dumbest way, that it's like no one knows the ending, but we for sure knew that this is just the beginning, and that there's so much more to be done. There's so much more to learn, and I think people are now just waking up into the field of which we are most passionate. So yeah, I'm very excited, and that brings me hope too, to hear that these conversations are maturing for you, and that people are taking this seriously. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing more about Sortile. If anybody wants to check out more of how to support you or to support this endeavors, where do they go?
You can always connect with me on LinkedIn. My name's Constanza Gomez. So just find me. It's a weird name, so easy to find.
Easy to find.
And you can always check out our website. We have like a contact form there if you'd rather do that. So yeah,
Good.
we get
Excellent. Looking forward to seeing more success come from you all at Sortile. Thank you for joining, Constanza.
Thank you.